They were called Peacemakers, as if sealing their own fate with an adjective. They were the administrative arm of the species consortium, border cartographers, stock accountants, and conflict judges. Wherever they arrived, they erected antennas, signed protocols, and installed stability systems that transformed nervous planets into calm charts. For centuries, it worked. Stars had schedules, rivers obeyed orbital floodgates, and entire peoples learned to breathe to the rhythm of the edicts, until cartography reached the blue planet. In preliminary reports, Earth looked like a typo of nature: restless tectonic plates, temperamental seas, mood-changing skies 3 times a day, and species that healed by burning to be reborn. A footer, almost, marked with an informal notice that crossed the bureaucracy as a private joke: Death World. Hive minds laughed at the exaggeration. Reptilian jurists called it folklore. Archivist cephalopods preferred numbers, high population density, irregular technology, and noisy culture. Conclusion: manageable resource. The decision came clean: to start the planetary stabilization protocol. Climate containment satellites to smooth hurricanes. Silence meshes to deflate riots. Mediators in robes to negotiate sovereignties. Long-term contracts to exchange autonomy for predictability. The manual was 300 pages long. Reality usually tears up manuals without reading the first one. The first open transmission descended through the ionosphere with the slow voice of someone who imagines himself to be a tutor. Humanity, deliver critical climate and defense commands. In return, we guarantee stability, order, security. There was no response. There were many, and at the same time, none. Thick silences on some continents, laughter at others, songs in squares, improvised radios on balconies, memes rising and falling in nets that changed course like fish. To the peacekeepers, it sounded like noise. For those who live in the wind, it was choreography. The lightships anchored in low orbit. Drones drew meshes over the oceans. The climate would be the first to learn etiquette. The algorithms sang with optimism: micro-adjustments of pressure, gentle redistribution of heat, and new trails for unruly storms. Humans will thank you, the standard text read. The sea held its breath for 3 days. In the bedroom, he exhaled with the impetus of someone who has been training forever. Where the mesh pushed, another current grew. The first wall of clouds rose as a mobile cathedral. Anomaly, they noted. Old fishermen smiled. Time. On rooftops, wing sails attached to building masts appeared. Urban weather comets deflecting winds into empty streets and escape channels. In the ports, engineers and surfers sewed technical fabric into bamboo frames. Paramedics marked routes with tapes and paint. Community radios began to talk about frequencies that the manual did not foresee. On paper, unregulated activity. On the ground, Tuesday. The orbital stabilizers increased power to correct deviations. That's when thousands of civilian antennas shed their skin. Universities, radio clubs, technical schools, merchant ships, amateur stations, scrap metal repurposed in orbit. An entire planet has tuned its own instruments and cast discrete notes into the spectrum. The mess entered the dance unintentionally. Small delays, deliberate echo, misplaced harmonics. All it took was minutes. The hurricanes passed where the Earth wanted, through empty corridors prepared the day before, through power plants shut down, through farms flooded on purpose, and through cities that raised cloth wings to push the wind back to the sea. In the reports, the word chaos appeared for the first time. Strange chaos, the one in which mobile hospitals were already erected before the rain, in which schools migrated to indoor courts before the alert, and in which kitchens connected by neighborhood generators served soup when the lights flickered. Strange chaos, this one who knew the name of the neighbor and the number of the house of the lady who needed medicine. The peacekeepers descended. Reptilians in togas wiped dust from tunics on humble staircases. Hive minds brought plasticized contracts. Cephalopods opened folders. They saw kitchens smelling of garlic, garages with scattered pieces, neighborhood libraries full of children, and workshops repairing bicycles and radios. They proposed order. They found culture. Overhead, the domes of silence descended like glass bells over critical neighborhoods. On the ground, messengers on foot departed. Window lights flashed codes. Old trams ran on new batteries, carrying paper with hand-drawn maps. They asked, confused, why a world that knows quantum internet pedals? They received, without translation, the practical answer: because legs don't fall into jammers, and because hands handing out tickets have zero latency to live today. From the consortium's point of view, Terra was stubborn. From Earth's point of view, it was Tuesday repeating Thursday's lessons: improvise, divide, tie, and help. It was in this mismatch that pride suffered its first crack. The second would come with the threatening announcement, "Give in, or we will neutralize defenses." And with the response that did not come by voice, but by practice. Networks broken into independent cells, regional plants mismatched from power plants, homemade satellites reoriented by garage telescopes, dams breathing together, and trains becoming supply columns. In the manual, this is called collapse. On Earth, it's called resilience. At dawn, when the promised blitz began, with metal teeth descending from the clouds and gravitational dogs squeezing neighborhoods like leashes, the peacekeepers still believed in spreadsheets. The planet below sharpened memory. Who had learned to tie a roof to the wind, to pull a boat against the current, to climb a hill with a cylinder on its back, to teach a child on the court when the room closed? These people were already in position. The prologue ends like this, with the consortium confident that it manages, and with the Earth apparently disordered, while rehearsing for millennia the choreography that the manual does not recognize. The rest of the story, for those who still believe that storms are enemies, comes as a surprise. For those who train in the consortium's first weapon, was invisible. Satellites spread wings like metallic dragonflies and dropped threads of energy over the oceans. The plan was simple: cut through the fury of the winds, tame currents, and turn wild seas into smooth graphics. They called it the Climate Stabilization Network. To them, storms were defects that needed to be corrected. For Earth, storms have always been teachers. For 3 days the sea was silent. Waves smoothed like silk. The air was trapped like contained breath. The peacekeepers smiled. Graphics showed unprecedented stability. It worked, they noted. But on the 4th day, the ocean surface shook like repressed muscle. The currents reversed, the winds swirled, and the first hurricane of the new era rose like a moving wall, larger than any satellite could embrace. Anomaly, the reports recorded. For fishermen who left even before dawn, that was just time. On the coast, humans did not run to shelters as resigned victims. They opened meteorological comets, sails attached to building masts, flexible fabrics that deflected gusts into deserted streets, creating planned wind corridors. On the beaches, engineers and surfers, side by side, erected kite barriers, wing structures that cut chains and redirected fury. Trained paramedics used civilian drones to drop emergency kits where the wind did not allow ambulances. Neighborhood workshops built makeshift turbines that drained storm power to maintain light in hospitals. From space, everything seemed to be chaos. On the floor, it was choreography. The stabilization network has increased power to correct anomalies. The sea received the extra strength as an invitation. The hurricane did not subside. He learned to dance against the pressure. It was then that civilian antennas began to emit invisible notes. Universities, radio clubs, merchant ships, and even amateur telescopes have repurposed space junk as instruments. The frequency spread out in waves that the network was not made to interpret. The satellites, designed to line up, began to wobble. The field, once rigid, has been transformed into a vibrant membrane. The peacekeepers recorded spectrum contamination. On Earth, they called it music. With the network out of phase for precious minutes, the hurricanes were driven like herds. They passed over already evacuated areas, crossed intentionally flooded fields, and dodged plants that were turned off on purpose. The alien math didn't get it. Humans didn't fight the storm. They led her. Urgent reports popped up. Irregular activity. Civil protocols interfere. Need for repression. The word chaos appeared. But within this chaos, there were kitchens heating soup in neighborhood generators, open schools on indoor courts, community radios guiding ambulances, and neighbors carrying neighbors to high ground. What seemed improvised, in practice, was collective training of centuries. Ethan Corrin didn't exist there. There was no single hero. The hero was the species itself, distributed in millions of hands, eyes, and voices. It was the lady who knew when to close the window so as not to break the glass. It was the fisherman who read the tide by the smell of the wind. It was the child who learned to hold a candle with a thick rope. The network called it a failure. Humanity called it Tuesday. In the Orbital Council, reptilians frowned on scaled hives of insectoids exchanging pheromones of concern, and archival cephalopods wiggled restless tentacles. Why did an unstable planet seem so comfortable in the midst of instability? How could a people without apparent discipline manage to neutralize millimetrically calibrated protocols? The answer was before them, but it was invisible to eyes trained for order. Humans do not learn to escape the storm. They learn within it. Later that week, the Peacekeeper satellites shut down for emergency maintenance. The consortium announced that it would be a technical recalibration. On the ground, humans just looked at the horizon, saw another cloud form, and smiled naturally. They knew that the climate is not controlled. He respects himself, understands himself, and, if necessary, uses himself as an ally. The Peacekeepers believed they had seen the worst. They did not understand that it was just the rehearsal. When the wind refused to obey, the consortium decided to silence its voice. Translucent domes descended over entire neighborhoods like glass bells. Inside them, nothing echoed as it should. Radios sizzled, SAN networks and networks became static, and cell phones showed full bars but did not know how to say hello. They called it zones of social stabilization. On the ground, it sounded like the old trick of those who don't understand a square, cut off conversation to cut courage. The silence was met first with fright, then with habits. Doors that used to open at every touch opened at the same pace because of feet. Messengers reappeared as if they had never been. Teenagers on flashing bicycles, ladies with reinforced bags, and motorcycle couriers who knew shortcuts that no map draws. Information began to travel in the body. Folded tickets, maps at hand, lists of medicines, and vigil shifts. Those who grew up with the internet learned, without ads, that a hand on another hand has zero latency. In the windows, lights flickered like disciplined fireflies. Morse came out of the closet of history and into everyday life. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. But now to say, we need ice, there's room here, and it comes out underneath. On the rooftops, community antennas have changed functions. What yesterday drew the signal of a soap opera, today blew beats. Rhythmic pulses that mark departure times, safe paths, and tides of volunteers. For alien sensors, it was noise. For neighbors, it was a voice. At the intersections, old trams returned with new batteries. Tourist trails became rescue lines, banks full of pills, flour bags, vegetable crates, soup thermoses, and water tanks. At each stop, collectors collected tickets, not money, but messages. In garages, printers whispered maps with arrows, street names, and collection points. Motorcycle workshops have become message centers, with blackboards and string connecting neighborhoods, as if the city were a child who learns geography with string and pins. The domes tried to tighten it more. They swept frequencies, densified the silence, and replaced the air with cotton. In response, the noise came out of the skin. Pots and pans hit the doors. Samba school drums called bars on street corners. Churches rang bells. Mosques called for prayers, and toreros sang points. The vibrations under the dome created acoustic tides that made sensors too sensitive to understand the party tremble. The pacifier report called it harmonic contamination. Those who danced called it a rehearsal. Then came the mediators in togas, trying to convince with seals and promises. Reptilians with golden eyes and a measuring tongue spoke of stability in makeshift auditoriums. Insectoid hives presented polished graphs, proposing the safety of the 5-year plan. Cephalopods have landed wet contracts on plastic tables. They heard things that didn't fit in the forms. We call each other by name. My neighbor is my password. If it's to shut up, sing louder. And, if it goes bad, let me know at Donna Ruth's window. The mediators noted organized cultural resistance and recommended normalization programs. The next day, classrooms migrated to courts. Doctors set up offices in parking lots. Lawyers wrote habeas corpus by hand, and children's choirs rehearsed under trees, singing loudly to cross the dome. Normalization was planned to tighten. Normality responded by expanding. On the fringes of the domes, party technology became a tool of war. Wedding drones with ribbons and lights were trained to fly low, between eaves, carrying envelopes from neighborhood to neighborhood. For the algorithm, they were decorative, non-hostile objects. For community kitchens, they were pigeons that do not stop on the roof of the authority. In alleys where silence was heavy, popsicle vendors pushed carts with hidden battery radios. When the cart bell slid on a specific note, it meant free path. It was learned that Bell also writes, "Not everything was art." He had a blind sweat. Scouts guiding ambulances with flashlights, forming veins of light between shadows. Neighborhood pharmacies writing down on paper what was missing for the entire street. And an old truck bringing what no one expected. Carpenters transforming doors into stretchers. Seamstresses turning canvas into raincoats. And locksmiths adapting baby seats into oxygen supports. To an alien who measures civilization by tower, it smelled of chaos. For those who have repaired a roof during the rain, it smelled like family. There were attempts to cut even the paper. Inspections collected pamphlets, inspectors tore up maps, and drones vacuumed up posters. The city responded with living walls. Recipes, instructions, and sequences of steps became murals painted at dawn, not photo art, but survival manuals. How to boil still water. How to tie tiles with a tire camera. Where to get medicine X at 2 p.m. and hand signals at 50 meters. It was ugly and urgent. Worked. Seeing that the conversation was not broken, the consortium tightened the siege on what it considered most fragile: time. They imposed circulation windows, cut nights with curfews, and tried to govern the city by orbiting clock. The clock on the floor responded with its own hands. Neighborhood hours do not obey decree, they obey habitus. If the market is at 5, the street wakes up at 4. If the medicine arrives at 10, the queue is organized at 9. If the ambulance corridor passes by at 6, no one parks there. Within 2 days, the consortium's windows were filled with people quietly punctual to everything needed, and empty to everything that was controlling. The report called it hair subversion. The neighborhood called it an agenda. In the countryside, silence met the latifundium of living things. Off-track harvesters were towed by oxen that learned their way before the machines. Engines died, hands picked up. In estuaries, shellfish gatherers formed networks of women and children, distributing protein as if praying for rain. Marine radios, short as size, kept fleets talking by codes that do not cross mountains but cross affection. The domes did not cover the entire sea. Murray does not accept audits. There was error, tiredness, and despair. At some summits, silence almost won out. People cried, screamed, and gave up for too many long minutes. And that's when the non-technical and most dangerous antidote appeared. Company. Sit next to you. Look them in the eye. Pour coffee. Deliver bread. Stay. The Pacificador sensor registered unauthorized agglomeration. The report noted that panic indicators were lowering. It ended without a chance. There is no equation for hand on shoulder. One day, the consortium sent a team of empathetic observers, young, light-robed reptilians trained to listen. They descended to a square covered by an ancient dome. They found children drawing maps on the sidewalk with chalk, a lady teaching sailor's knots, a boy adjusting the brakes on a bicycle, and a priest and a mãe de santo organizing a line for basic food baskets. They asked why they did not accept the order that brought stability. They answered without quotation marks, because no one said out loud, "This is the order that keeps us alive." The consortium then tried to erase not only the voice but also the trace. They confiscated bicycles, dismantled antennas, and collected pots. They discovered that there are too many things to collect when everyone else has them. In 3 days, there were more antennas than before, more pots, and more bicycles. In 5, the domes were full of micro-fissures of meaning. Each house a point, each point a wire, each wire a network that does not fit into a diagram. By the end of the week, the peacekeepers updated their vocabulary. They replaced noise with passive resistance, disorder with dangerous resilience, and anomie with diffuse autonomy. The name did not change reality. Silence had failed. The conversation they wanted to silence had gained muscle. And realizing this, the peacekeepers made the classic mistake of proud stewards. They threatened what they could not accomplish. Hand over planetary keys, or we will proceed to surgical neutralization. Earth did not respond with bravado. He tied it. He broke networks into smaller cells, cut interdependencies that could become leashes, doubled water routes, tripled bread routes, taught grandparents how to tune battery radios, taught grandchildren how to climb roofs, tuned backyard telescopes, and tested wing sails on wide avenues. When the ultimatum won, there was no shouting. There was preparation. The war of silence ended as it began, with an attempt to reduce people to graphics and with people becoming a figure of flesh impossible to reduce. The consortium never learned to listen to the neighborhood. The Earth has never forgotten which neighborhood listens to which neighborhood. The next chapter would not bring domes, it would bring teeth. And on the morning the teeth came down, the city was already chewing back. When the summits failed, the peacekeepers decided to abandon subtlety. If silence did not bend a people, perhaps direct imposition would work. Then came the official mediators, reptilians in impeccable robes, hives of insectoids in disciplined formation, and cephalopods with shimmering skin bearing damp contracts inside crystal boxes. The protocol was clear. Persuade first, submit later. They arrived in the capitals with ceremonial entourages, blue flags waving, and speeches full of words such as order, security, and stability. They set up shop in tall buildings filled with shiny billboards, set up trading desks in luxury hotels, and handed out leaflets that promised to standardize everything from climate to politics. Lines of humans eager to join the spectacle of intergalactic order were waiting. They found streets alive. In the kitchens, the smell of garlic and fried onions drowned out any rehearsed speech. In garages, young people dismantled parts of old engines to reassemble as improvised generators. In schools, teachers taught outdoors, writing formulas on wooden boards, while children laughed at the wind that blotted out the chalk. Doctors attended in parking lots, transforming ambulances into offices and tarpaulins into triage. Lawyers wrote habeas corpus by hand, without waiting for the internet to return. The mediators saw a civilization that functioned without the need for a decree. It was not a centralized resistance, but a cultural web that stretched from neighborhood to neighborhood, from square to square, and from workshop to workshop. A network of invisible relationships, woven with neighborliness, improvisation, and solidarity. To the hive mind, accustomed to vertical orders, this was a dangerous enigma. They cataloged it as social contagion. Each gesture generated others, each help called for more help, and each improvisation became a model for another improvisation. For the reptilians, who saw power in symbols, it was a threat. A people that transforms a pot into a drum, a bicycle into mail, and a party into a transmission network is a people that does not accept being measured. For the cephalopods, guardians of contracts, it was an aberration, how to sign clauses with people who prefer to match in their eyes. They then tried the discourse of superiority. In an impromptu assembly, a reptilian mediator raised his metallic voice to explain, "You are undisciplined. They need stability. Without us, nothing lasts." He received no applause. He received heavy silence, eyes fixed, hands dirty with grease holding a flashlight. Human silence was not surrender. It was judgment. The following week, the peacekeepers hardened. They introduced orbital curfews, turning off entire neighborhood lights in the distance. They tried to control the city by clockwork, erasing streets at 9 and re-establishing them at 6. What they saw was something inexplicable to their tables. At 9, bakeries opened back windows, squares were filled with children's choirs, and neighbors held vigils with lanterns. At 6, when the official light returned, the communities had already fulfilled their day. At the fairs, producers organized parallel chains, old trucks, donkeys with carts, and motorcyclists carrying bags of vegetables through alleys. In the temples, cults, masses, and prayers have become centers of coordination. In abandoned stadiums, groups of young people rehearsed songs that, without saying anything, said everything. Every chant, every drum, every whistle was a password. The Peacemaker report described it as organized anarchy. On the ground, it was just culture in action. And then came the fatal error, a decree. The peacekeepers announced that they would soon implement the forced normalization protocol. Surgical blitz. There will be no resistance possible. Earth's response was not pronounced at the conference. It was pronounced in practice. Power grids were divided into smaller cells. Power plants were disconnected from orbital plants. Homemade satellites were aligned by backyard telescopes. Dams were programmed to open joints, such as collective lungs, and old trains carried supplies as discrete columns. The peacekeepers, seeing from space, called it a chaotic collapse. On the floor, they called it preparation. Because humans understood something that the consortium would never understand. When the order from above imposes itself as a cage, the true order is born from below, made of neighborhood, improvisation, and memory. The weight of culture was not in monuments or laws. It was in the repeated gesture, in the inherited solidarity, and in the improvisation rehearsed by generations that learned to survive in instability. For the consortium, it was dangerous irrationality. For humanity, it was only Wednesday. And that's how the weight of culture cracked the pacifying arrogance. The promised blitz was approaching, but in the heart of the streets the people were already in position, not as a classic army, but as a living memory, ready to resist. The ultimatum hovered like a cloud of lead. Deadline set. Right time. Measured words. Forced normalization, read the cold headline. In orbitals, jurists from the consortium checked seals, beehives fine-tuned protocols, and module pilots rehearsed descents. It was the promise of a surgical coup. Surgeries, however, require an immobile patient. The Earth has never stood still. What they would call a collapse began as division, not a disorderly rupture, but a deliberate fractalization. Electric grids, once big, proud, and organic, have become islands, neighborhoods with their own generators, solar microplants on rooftops, stream turbines feeding alleys, pinwheels in daycare centers, and biodigesters in communal kitchens. Where once there was a single easy-to-cut backbone, there were now thousands of thin, stubborn strands that died without killing anyone and were reborn around the corner. The same happened with water. State-owned companies and backyard wells have made a quiet truce. Cisterns sprouted in schoolyards, water tanks were interconnected by firefighter hoses, artesian wells were mapped by hand, water trucks were escorted by bicycles, dams combined to open floodgates in coordinated breaths. At dawn, when valleys were empty. At sunset, when banks knew how to move away. The consortium modeled hydraulic losses. Those who live in buckets have learned flow. Logistics? The planet pulled old words from drawers that sounded like dust and turned into steel. Sleeping railroad lines woke up with new grease. Freight trains dragged wagons with beans, salt, medicine, batteries, and delivery kits. Where tracks were missing, barges slid down rivers swollen by dam design. Where the river did not reach, convoys of tractors and pickup trucks crossed crops along paths that tractors had always known. The satellite map via anthill. The anthills were seen by name. Enter Zay's farm, take So Alvaro's bridge, and go down the Donna Teresa shortcut. For the algorithm, noise. For us, route. Communication, the old heel. The domes of silence had shown that cutting off voices was possible for a while. Then the voice became a landscape. Battery-powered radios popped up on balconies. Community repeaters were born in church towers, water tanks, and high slabs, and antenna cables were extended like clotheslines. Universities made 3D-printed RF kits available. Didactic hackers turned tutorials into flyers. People who didn't even know each other spent nights tuning Yagi antennas with electrical tape and a school ruler. Beyond the waves, meat messengers continued to crisscross the city, now with neighborhood credentials. A rectangle of paper in a pocket with a bakery stamp was worth more than an orbital stamp. In the sky, a gentle insurrection. Astronomy clubs, old radio amateurs, young people from technical courses, and a small crowd of fools synchronized observations. Erased satellites have earned nicknames. Some were awakened by solar pressure guidance tricks, others by homemade reflectors. Nothing was overturned. It was enough to change degrees. It was enough to make an eye look slightly wrong and an algorithm to lose ground for microseconds. The consortium recorded low-intensity orbital anomalies. The Earth called it, pointing a mirror to flash. Security, the part that always comes with a hood. Instead of vain militias, the city took turns. Neighbors set up vigils with whistles and lanterns, clipboards and common sense. No uniform, no rango, no scoop for glory. Steps counted, streets covered, names noted. When a reconnaissance drone appeared, the lights drew S's on the ground to confuse counting. When trucks passed without license plates, word of mouth became sirens. Don't go up, swerve, and don't open. Distrust has become protocol. Health did not wait to call. Popular pharmacies have become mini-centers. Family doctors taught how to assemble kits for the streets. Midwives circulated with large backpacks like winter coats. Improvised PS appeared in corners of markets with door stretchers and IV hanging on a hanger. Nurses trained volunteers in 5 lessons, measuring pulse, recognizing shock, sterilizing, immobilizing, and calming. When the Blitz came, I would not have time to teach. It was taught before. Education and care went together. Teachers opened street libraries. NGO monitors handed out notebooks with maps, simple rules, and games that happened to teach signs. Children, always the best antennae, knew the basics. 3 claps mean okay. Hand spinning means water. Hitting the pole calls an adult, and the double whistle is back. Culture means that improvisation does not need to be invented every time. The peacekeepers watched the fractalization with technical horror. When they tried to understand, the image was sand. When they tried to squeeze, he slipped. They looked at the macro. The Earth split until each cell was too small to be worth the shot. When they attacked one end, 2 ends appeared. It was not a serpent myth. It was cellular logistics. Then came the symbolic layer, always her. In stadiums, rehearsals with drums and choirs combined rhythms that later served as a metronome for displacements. In temples, calendars were adjusted to open doors during working hours and not liturgical hours. In toreros, points kept simple messages hidden in the obvious. If the chorus repeated 4 times, 4 blocks. If it accelerated in the middle, run more. If it paused, wait. For those who do not believe, it seemed like folklore. For those who needed it, it was code. In the countryside, cooperatives of small producers combined revolving stocks. Each one saved some for the other. Solar coolers were assembled from scrap trucks. When a place fell, the neighbor opened. When the neighbor fell, the other one doubled. The cut did not find a loose end. The cut was tiring. There were, of course, failures. Groups tried to take over the command that the manuals promised to generals. In 2 neighborhoods, steel committees were born with the air of a uniform and the voice of those in charge. They were short-lived. Without neighborliness, there is no logistics. People swerved, pots closed, and radios changed frequencies. A boss without people is an echo. The lesson spread. Authority is who serves. Those who don't serve are left over. On the border between city and country, workshops have become dry shipyards. Tugboats received reels of steel cable, reinforced hooks, and protections on the rudders. They did not prepare for naval battle. They were preparing to pull. Descent modules, when they came, heavy and full of pride, would be just another body trapped in quicksand. Boots, cable, anchors in X, pulls in cadence, sings to mark the rhythm, tilts, releases, pulls again. To tow is an old verb. On the highest rooftops, winged sails slept folded, lined up like giant umbrellas, sewn with technical fabric and fair cloth, with bamboo and fiber, tied in stitches calculated by the experience of those who have flown kites since childhood. It was not urban eccentricity, it was social wind engineering. The final preparation was silence, not the imposed silence of the consortium, but the attentive silence of those who finished tying rope before the rain. Bells did not ring, drums stopped, radios went down. Hands tested knots, reviewed lists, checked buttons, and looked at eyes. The planet seemed to hold its breath. In orbit, the protocol called it pre-operational calm. Down here, someone whispered the usual, "It's today," and it was in this restrained dawn that the consortium, satisfied with its reading of the world, activated the playbook. Descent modules heated up. Gravitational dogs adjusted invisible bites. Drones aligned geometries, such as the choreography of metallic birds. The frozen screens showed quiet neighborhoods, docile rivers, folded candles, and motionless antennas. It seemed that, finally, the patient lying down would accept the surgery. What the manual does not contemplate is the word raised. Organized chaos is not an explosion. It is waking up in choir. The minute the teeth came in, the city moved like voluntary muscle. Tugs started engines. The sails rose like a shoal. The radios whispered to bars. The trains slid on the already polished tracks. The whistles streaked the air. The pots saved their sounds for later. There was no single command. There was an agreement. The organized chaos ended before the blitz began. Because of the organization, there was not an organizational chart. It was memory in practice. The consortium would descend on a beehive that has no queen. He would discover, in minutes, what the storms have taught for centuries. Order that comes from above breaks with wind. Order that comes from within bends and returns. The chapter ends like this, in a dry cut to dawn. Enemy engines entrenching the air, metallic teeth lowering, and an entire planet on tiptoe, ready not to hit but to hold, dodge, sing, and pull. The manual calls this the theater of operations. We, at home, call it Tuesday with a task. The dawn came heavy, as if the sky had swallowed iron. From low orbits, descent modules spread wings of plasma and plunged toward cities. Behind them, a cold geometry of drones streaked the firmament, like metal birds that know no fatigue. Underneath it all, gravitational dogs activated, invisible fields that compressed entire neighborhoods, trying to crush blocks as if they were board pieces. In orbital command, the Peacekeepers proudly recorded the phrase they had rehearsed for centuries. Beginning of surgical neutralization. But on the ground, the answer did not come in words. He came in concentrated silence. The first bites of the gravity dogs closed in on entire neighborhoods, doubling streets and buildings. The asphalt broke, and the walls creaked. But within those perimeters, there was nothing to crush. Refrigerators had been emptied the night before, hospitals quietly transferred, and families were guided by simple signs: 3 clapping hands, a whistle, and a flashlight flashing at the right window. When the force fell on them, it found empty shells. In the ports, the Peacekeeper modules landed with titanium weight. The metal claws dug into the piers, trying to take root. Then small tugboats, fishing boats, and makeshift rafts approached like anthills at sea. Thick cables attached themselves to the metal casings, and hundreds of arms sang the rhythm of the work: pull, release, pull, release. One module tipped back into the waters, dragging others in the fall. The consortium called it an anchor failure. The fishermen called it a tide, pulling back what did not belong to them. On the wide avenues, the wingsails opened like sudden shoals. Fabrics sewn with technical fiber and fair cloth danced in the wind with bamboo and improvised cables. When the drones dived into swarms, the sails cut currents, deflected gusts, and confused sensors. The sky was filled with shapes that did not obey binary logic. Giant kites, improvised birds, and childhood engineering transformed into walls of wind. The report spoke of an aerodynamic anomaly. For those who were below, it was just a windy party. In the alleys, battery-operated radios whispered orders amid the hiss. A crack was a signal to go up the slope. 2 interference sounds called for retreat. Firm voices advised, "Take it up, close the gate, hold the corner." Samba schools, which used to rehearse for carnival, now set bars for travel. Every drumbeat said go. Every pause said wait. The streets were transformed into living scores, where each step was music of resistance. Meanwhile, heaven was fighting its own dispute. Backyard telescopes, astronomy clubs, insomniac radio amateurs, and teenage hackers woke up retired satellites. Some were mirrored with improvised reflectors. Others were reoriented with solar pressure. There was no need to destroy anything. Misalignment was enough. It was enough to make one satellite look wrong and another blink out of step. The Peacemaker constellations, perfect in mathematics, stumbled in their own steps. The peacekeepers expected a classic army. They found neighborhoods that functioned as thousands of hives without a queen. They cut one route. Another appeared. They knocked down a net. 2 improvised antennas appeared on the slabs. It was like trying to crush water with your hand. The more force, the more it escaped through your fingers. On the 3rd day, the consortium attempted its last letter. A pulse of silence stronger than all the previous ones plunged neighborhoods into absolute darkness. No radio, no light, no frequency. Just empty. It was then that the earth responded as it always did, with company. Candles lit in the windows. In the squares, voices started timidly, then grew into a chorus. Children clapped, elderly people marked the pace with canes, and improvised drums filled the air. The planned silence turned into spontaneous music. The sound crossed fishes, echoed in alleys, and multiplied on rooftops. The peacekeeper sensors did not understand. The algorithms, unable to measure human rhythm, crashed. Final report of the operation. Catastrophic failure, unstable environment, recalcitrant species, high reputational risk, recommendation, withdrawal. And so ended the pacifying blitz. Not in a clean victory, not in a humiliating defeat, but in something that no manual had predicted, an entire planet refusing to be a patient of the surgery. When the lightships ascended back, there was no grand celebration, no triumphal parades. What remained on the ground was the calm practice of neighbors who knew that week, they had done only what they had always done: train in the storm. The withdrawal was never announced as a defeat. In the official communiques, the peacekeepers spoke of strategic suspension and adjustment of priorities. Cold words like bandages applied to wounds that are still open. But inside the command rooms, between sealed reports and stares that avoided crossing, everyone knew the operation had failed. In the corridors of orbital stations, reptilians in togas lowered their voices. Hives of insectoids interrupted the emission of pheromones of victory, and archival cephalopods rolled up contracts that would never be signed. There was a new weight in the air. It wasn't just the taste of frustration, it was the unprecedented feeling of having faced something that did not fit into protocol. Humanity had not won with armies, fleets, or sophisticated weapons. He had won with neighborhood improvisation, music, fishing boats, bicycles, cloth sails, and battery-operated radios. He had won by turning his own daily life into an arsenal. This was confusing, because it contradicted everything that the consortium understood as power. The mediators who had stepped on the ground came back changed. Some had seen children flashing light signals from window to window, forming nets that looked like invisible webs. Others remembered the smell of pots on the fire even under curfew. There were those who could not forget the choir in the squares, when an entire neighborhood sang to break the artificial silence. Many were unable to translate what they witnessed. What is recorded as an anomaly in a report in the heart had been recorded as fear. Fear not of destruction, but of what cannot be controlled. The peacekeepers had always believed that order came from above. that stability was something imposed by diagrams and protocols. But on Earth they saw something different, an order that is born from below, alive, chaotic, and at the same time unbreakable. An order made of memory, improvisation, and solidarity. And this terrified them, because there was no tool to break what has no center. The Council of War met in secrecy. For hours, they discussed alternatives: total invasion, orbital blocking, and selective strikes. But each proposal died in the same realization. The resistance was not in military bases, nor in satellites, nor in structures that could be destroyed. He was in every street, every neighborhood, every hand that knew how to improvise. It was an infinite hydra, but not made of heads, made of people. It was there that the phrase came up that spread among them like a whisper: "You don't manage those who trained in the storm." The Earth was then marked on the consortium's maps with a red border. A discreet but definitive note: exception zone, not stabilizable, not manageable, not recommended for intervention. Officially, it was a strategic reconnaissance. In practice, it was an admission of fear. On this side, life went on. Roofs were repaired, schools reopened, and fairs filled with colors. The scars remained, but not as a reminder of defeat, as proof that the species had resisted together. On the following nights, in neighborhoods where the light still failed, neighbors gathered around candles, told stories of the attack, and remembered how tugboats pulled modules, how sails deflected drones, and how an entire city turned into coral. And they always ended the same way: laughing. Not because it had been easy, but because laughter was also survival. The aliens, in their distant academies, continued to study the case. They produced academic reports, cultural analyses, and response simulations, but none of them solved the riddle. How do you fight a species that turns routine into a weapon, that turns chaos into method, that turns a storm into a teacher? The answer did not come in formulas, but in memories. Every peacemaker who was on Earth now carried a silent weight, the memory of steady, tired, but still willing human eyes. Not eyes of conquerors, but eyes of ordinary people, of neighbors who held the line not out of order, but out of care. That was what frightened them, a power that needs no crowns or commands. And since that day, the lesson has been a warning between distant species. When someone mentioned the possibility of stabilizing the blue planet, there was always a pause. The younger ones laughed in disbelief. But the veterans, those who had seen it with their own eyes, took a deep breath and answered only, "Don't try. There, even silence sings." The consortium has never admitted in public that it has failed. In official records, the operation on Earth was filed as an inconclusive experiment, an elegant expression for defeat. In the reports circulated only among senior advisors, the vocabulary was more honest. Catastrophic failure, unpredictable environment, recalcitrant species, and zone of exception. It was the bureaucratic way of confessing what no one dared to say out loud. They had been afraid. Humanity, on the other hand, did not write communiques or proclaim victories. There was no parade, no flags raised, and no stone monuments. There was only the immediate return to life. Roofs were patched up, markets reopened, and schools resumed operation in improvised courtyards. The scars of the Blitz were everywhere: cracked walls, injured streets, and burned antennas. But in each of them there were also signs of repair: new bricks, fresh paint, and spliced cables. Where the peacekeepers saw chaos, humans saw continuity. On nights without power, neighbors gathered around campfires. Children asked to hear again the story of how boats pulled modules out to sea, how giant sails fooled drones, and how battery radios turned alleys into war corridors. And the older ones counted, laughing, because laughter was also part of the victory. It was not a laugh of arrogance, but of recognition. Surviving together is a form of humor against the impossible. In distant academies, species studied the terrestrial campaign as if observing a wild animal from behind thick glass. They noted that human strength was not in advanced technology nor in military discipline, but in something more diffuse, almost invisible: the ability to transform routine into a weapon. Pots, bicycles, music, light signals, neighborhood. All of this, added together, had defeated protocols designed to subjugate entire empires. To them, it was incomprehensible. For humans, it was just memory. Over time, the name Death World was no longer just a joke or warning. It has become a label of respect, used with caution in galactic meetings. Some said in a threatening tone, "Be careful, it's a death world." Others, in a tone of reverence, "They train in the storm." But everyone, without exception, learned the same lesson: not to confuse human silence with surrender. Because the silence that the consortium tried to impose was returned in a corner. The order they tried to impose from above was replaced by a living order, born from below. Cold logic broke in the face of improvisation heated by culture. The mathematics of domination found the variable it did not know how to calculate: the common human. And so, between forgotten reports and neighborhood stories, the lesson was engraved in the universe. The Earth does not manage itself. The Earth faces itself, and loses. The peacekeepers went on to other worlds, trying to repeat protocols, but at each council table, there was always someone who uncomfortably remembered the blue planet. The subject was avoided, as if to talk about a scar that was still burning. And when new generations asked why that world remained free, the answer came short, dry, and loaded with memory. Because there, even the storm is a teacher, and humans study.